Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome to the Visibility Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. Spearheaded by members of the Cultural Awareness Coalition, the project is the brainchild of several organizations and individuals with shared values who sit on the project steering team. We hope that the podcast series creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world. With us today, we have two very exciting guests with a wealth of experience and knowledge, Mr. Kevin Kendrick and Ms. Kimberly Houston. Kevin Kendrick worked from 1976 to 1981 at two police departments at Wayne State University and the Detroit Police Department. In 1981, he joined the FBI and spent the next 25 years at the FBI working virtually in every area of investigative responsibility, including 2 tours of duty at the FBI headquarters. He retired from the FBI in 2006 and accepted the position of Vice President of Global Security for Dow Corning Corporation in Midland, Michigan. While in Midland, Kevin served on several boards, including the Midland Area Community Foundation, the Legacy Center for Community Success, the Midland Noon Rotary Club, where he served as the past president, the Center Stage Theater Advisory Board, and the Midland County Historical Site. He's a strong advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and was a strong force on the Cultural Awareness Coalition, which is hosting the Visibility Project. Kimberly Houston has over 40 years of leadership experience in business, philanthropy, and fund development. She retired from Dow Corning in 2012 and led numerous strategic initiatives as the Chief Diversity Officer, Global Community Relations Leader, and President, Dow Corning Foundation. She served as Interim Executive Director of the YWCA Great Lakes Bay Region. She was highlighted in the Midland County Historical Society's exhibit 2020 Vision, Seeing Her Story. Kimberly is a CCF certified coach practitioner, trained in unconscious bias, and is a certified cultural intelligence advanced professional by the Cultural Intelligence Center based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She will be completing her applied positive psychology certification in creative well-being this year. In today's podcast, we'll be learning from the expertise and experiences from both Kimberly and Kevin as we talk about their experiences growing up as African Americans through the Civil Rights era into the Black Lives Matter movement of today. Kevin will be sharing some of the experiences in law enforcement, particularly their relation to African American experiences. Kimberly has a wealth of knowledge on the topic of unconscious bias and will help us learn more about taking a look inside ourselves to strive to do more and to be better in our community. Welcome, Kevin and Kimberly. I'm so excited to have you both as our first guests for the Visibility Project podcast series. Today, we're going to jump in, and I have a number of questions for you today. But really, generally speaking, I want to ask you a lot of questions about your knowledge first, like you to share your knowledge. And then a number of questions is going to be about you sharing your experiences. And then lastly, I'm going to have you guys just tell us as listeners, what are some things that we should know, or what should we do now? What's some action items for us to do? But with that being said, I'm going to jump right into you asking you guys to share your wealth of knowledge. Kimberly, I guess, could you start? I'm going to ask you, given the long history of injustices against African American people in the United States, why do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement has such momentum at this moment in time? Why now?
Thank you so much for having us here. I think about 2020 and January, I think about turning toward 2020 and all the expectations that everybody had and how 2020 has been so different than what we expected. And I think this is a time of, I'm a spiritual person, so I see it as a time of spiritual sort of renewal and some peace and a call to action for us to recognize our global humanity. So that's sort of Kimberly's answer. That's Kimberly's answer. If I look at it from what I see, I see that for me, our society is a bit out of balance. We've tipped too far in different directions, if you will. This is not a political discussion, but I think we have gotten to a place with political and governmental leadership that feels divisive to me and out of balance. It lacks courage, people not working together, and we're not representing our espoused values. So I don't know if other people were feeling that, but I was. And then I think we've got, in some respects, the tragic death of George Floyd and the advent of social media colliding. So live streaming every moment of our lives. And what we saw in that moment was a death occur right in front of us for so many of us. And I think that each of us recognizing diversity, it resonated differently. I heard one of my friends say, Kimberly, when George Floyd called for his mother, he was calling for me.
Wow.
And it also speaks to just watching how policing works. So we kind of got up close and personal to just the whole tragedy and the whole process in a moment. It was crystallized. And we've been in quarantine, with COVID-19. So our engagement, our lack thereof, well-being, mental health is a little bit off balance also. And I do believe I'm of a certain generation that younger people have experienced a different life and a different trauma than my generation, which means that now they're more connected. They don't understand the differences maybe that we see, feel, and believe. They're more global and they're more passionate and courageous. So that's why I think just we're at a moment in time in history.
Wow. Really impactful. Kevin, do you want to add anything onto that? Why do you think now is when this momentum is really gaining movement right now?
And again, I echo Kim in saying thank you for giving us the opportunity to be your first guest on this podcast. Really looking forward to the discussion. I agree with all of what Kim said. I looked at this and I've asked myself that question as well. Why is BLM taking off in the way that it is? And I do think that what we're seeing is largely a realization of all of these disparate incidents involving police actions that people have not been able to connect over the years. But now when you have an 8-minute and 46-second glimpse into a man's life literally being taken away from him, when everyone has an opportunity to see that, especially when you have concerned citizens on the sidelines saying, we understand what's happening. They could see what was going on. I think people are tired. I think people are tired. They've connected the dots. They've seen that this is not an isolated incident, that this is something that just, when you couple it with Breonna Taylor, and you couple it with the young man who was jogging in Georgia, when you couple all of these things together and you see this systemic injustice, people are tired because it seems to be happening in a way and in a manner that is disproportionate to our numbers in society. And people are essentially tired. We've seen levels of activity beginning with the current president's inauguration. We've seen activism at levels that we have not seen. And I think what we are witnessing is Americans of every type saying, we are tired of business as usual. We are tired of the few having voice for all of us and doing things without regard to the rights of others, the dignity of others, and the humanity of others.
Very well said. And I wholeheartedly agree that it's a moment in time now where everything is visible to people instantaneously. And I think that's a really good point. Another question, something that is discussed a lot in inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion circles, is the idea of unconscious biases. I'm going to ask Kimberly, you to lead this one off. Could you help us understand what unconscious biases are and what does that mean? And how does it apply to this situation?
Yeah, I can, Jeremiah, and I appreciate you asking, because doing work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I would just ask, as we are all sort of walking through this time, that we take moments to think about words and what words mean. And especially in diversity, equity, inclusion work that I do, when we talk about racial justice or criminal justice, we use different words. They actually mean different things. So thank you for asking. And I'll just share with you that I am work with the Cultural Intelligence Center in Grand Rapids and have been trained in their unconscious bias work. And just want to share with you some thoughts that they've provided to me on this topic. So unconscious bias is also known as implicit bias. And it really represents attitudes and stereotypes that people may be unconsciously attributing to other people or groups of people. And part of this is just us becoming very aware of it. So it's really our thoughts, our mindsets, which shape our behaviors. And they happen very automatically. They happen emotionally. They happen fast, they're effortless. Many times we're not even aware that a reaction is going on. So the challenge I would give to the listeners is beginning to think about which biases do I have. Based on the research, it's everybody has biases. So if anybody's listening and thinking that they don't, they need to know that they do. And they need to uncover what that is. So which biases are mine? Because we all have them. Let me give you a couple of examples. Affinity bias, it just means I feel more comfortable with people like myself. So if you're with people like yourself, you're going to feel comfortable. And if you're in a group with people who are different than you, where you don't have as much affinity, it's going to feel uncomfortable to you. And that's going to happen in your body. And very quickly, you're going to know that, okay, this feels different to me. It's a fight or flight kind of response, very effortless. Now, let me give you another one, attractiveness bias. This is a place where we give favor to, and we assume that people who are more attractive are more talented, able, effective, and successful, which they're not. They're just attractive. So it's just thinking through that. There's normative bias. And let me stop there. I'll come back to that one. Then there's a halo versus horn or pitchfork bias, if you will. This is one we talk about when we're thinking about hiring people. So if you see or you know a person is good at one thing, we think that they're good at a lot of things. By the same token, if we see someone in a poor light, then we attribute a lot of negative things, or it colors how we see that person in more of a negative light, even if it's just one thing. And then another would be normative bias. And these are just examples. But normative bias is anything that goes against tradition or norm. We think it's not good. So if you've been in a work environment and people have said, you've made a comment or added to a discussion and people turn to you and they say, oh, that's not how we do that here. You're getting normative bias because they're saying, okay, but we do it like this. And it's a very automatic response to different things. So that's what implicit unconscious bias means. So again, I would challenge the listeners there to think about which one of these biases do I own? And I can provide some more information on that if you'd like, just list of biases. There's tests that you can take to just sort of uncover. And I would just say this is, for me, I'm a behavioral scientist, so it's really, I believe, a discovery activity that we're all going through. And I would ask that your listeners, again, have curiosity about uncovering some new things about themselves that will help them to grow.
I can imagine it takes a lot of vulnerability to look into those unconscious biases too, because you're admitting then you have these thoughts and you're having to do a lot of deep soul searching there to imagine what those are. So it does take a lot of work, I can imagine, to look through those.
So maybe we should have some unconscious bias groups and sitting groups and talk about that to make ourselves more comfortable with talking about our biases. Because again, it's the recognition that we all have them. And I think if we can kind of sit in that and say, okay, we've all got that, but then we can sit in, and just to be able to talk to people that we are feeling most comfortable with. If that's our friends, our family, find the space where it's safe for you and begin to have those conversations. That's not a conversation you want to have in a space where if you feel real vulnerable, it'll be traumatic for you.
I think it's important to point out too that Kim, what you said there is those types of biases are common. I mean, it's normal for us to feel more comfortable around people who look like us.
Who look like us.
I mean, that's I'm more comfortable around Black people. I'm more comfortable around guys for the most part. It's just, that's normal. So I think if you can take that first step and just say to yourself, yeah, maybe I need to broaden my horizons a little bit more and have those conversations. They can actually not be, very difficult conversations, but they are necessary conversations.
And important, I think, and just as important at this time that we really do a deeper level of work, both personally and individually and collectively than we've done in the past. And it calls for more trust and vulnerability. But as Kevin said, I would say, Kevin, I feel more comfortable around guys too, because I had brothers.
Yeah.
But you may not know that by looking at me, right? I mean, because you can't tell, but you know what I'm saying? It's where we have affinity, and people have different affinity in different places, because our brains work different, and it's lots of different ways that we feel comfortable, but it's just kind of leaning into that and knowing it, but getting comfortable. I always say when I do diversity, equity, and inclusion training work, that it's important that you get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Also, CNN did a really good show, I think it was Monday of this week, on unconscious bias, and it was very well done. Frederica Whitfield hosted it. If you haven't seen it, I would heartily encourage you to take a look at that. To your listeners, Jeremiah, because it was very well done. It talked about not just civil rights, but silver rights. Those are the rights to the boardroom, the rights to access to higher opportunities in some of our places of business, and why so many front offices and so many executive suites are not very diverse. But it was, I think, a very well done challenge to businesses to take a harder look at how inclusive you are and how your organizations look.
That's great. I had another question that's kind of in a similar vein. We hear so many people say that, like, I don't say racist things. I don't have those thoughts. I'm not racist. But there's a lot of talk now. It's not just enough to be not racist, but the anti-racism is key. I'm going to open up to either one of you, Kevin or Kimberly. Could you define what anti-racism means to you and give us a little more clarity on what that means?
For me, it's simple. I mean, to me, being anti-racist just means you are fighting against racist. To your point, it's not enough to just say I'm not racist. But what are you doing in your life to fight racism? And it doesn't have to be anything confrontational. It means talking to people if they tell something that's an off-color joke. It means getting involved. It means purposefully surrounding yourself with people who don't look like you, and with opening your personal experiences to people who are different from you, who are of a different race, of a different gender, of a different sexuality. It means just really fighting against racism in all of its form, whether it's individual racism, where you have people who are overtly racist, whether it's interpersonal racism or structural racism or institutional racism. It's taking a stand against all of those things and pushing back against what sometimes I think we just accept as being normal.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm going to put you on spot a little bit more, Kevin. I'm going to have another question for you. Going along with your knowledge, you have a long history with the FBI. And so given your background with the FBI, could you give us a little perspective on how law enforcement interacts with the public, and in particular with African-American citizens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's an interesting relationship, one that has obviously a lot of history going back even into the time when slaves were first brought to our country. I was watching a webinar the other day, and it talked about how in 1669 Virginia slave masters were given the authority to kill their slaves if they resisted authority. And so this is 1669. Slavery is still a nascent thing in our country at this time. But even at that point, owners were given the authority to kill their slaves. If they resisted authority. So you just fast forward. You look at, of course, slavery during in the South during the 1860s and even before the 1850s, and the institution of people who were paid to watch the slaves, the slave patrollers, given license to really do anything they wanted to do with those slaves. Fast forward to the 1920s, where we saw a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and you saw police departments becoming more, I guess, more just becoming, looking a certain way, and our urban areas beginning to develop as the Great Migrations occurred in the 20th century, and we see the establishment of housing places of housing projects in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and then you have a lack of diversity in police departments, which helps to create this us versus them mentality. We have wars that are occurring, and we need to have jobs for these soldiers that are returning. So rather than recruiting people from the community, you're starting to employ people from the military who are used to just things being very black and white. And that helps to, I think, create even more friction between the police and communities. Before I was an FBI agent, I was a Detroit police officer for 3 years. And it was interesting. When I joined the Detroit Police Department, there was a requirement that police officers had to live in the city of Detroit. And it was hotly contested. Our police union at that time fought it. And the mayor at that time was Coleman Young. Coleman Young was a very polarizing individual. There's no question about that. But this idea of having police live in the communities that they police actually is a pretty smart one. This is how you build neighborhoods. It's how you build community. When you have the people who are responsible for enforcing the laws actually being a part of the community and not being mercenaries, if you will, people who just come in and leave at the end of their shift to go home to the suburbs, you're creating the potential for conflict. And so this whole system of policing in our country is one that has an extensive history. It's been supported by some of our societal institutions, housing projects, employment for military, the expectation that officers don't have to live in the communities that they police. It's a recipe for friction, and especially not recruiting from the communities that they are policing in. When you have police departments that are overwhelmingly of one ethnic persuasion or one race rather, in communities that are of overwhelmingly one race, it's a recipe for conflict. And we have what we have. And I think the picture of it, I go right back to George Floyd and the officer with his knee on his neck, with his hand in his pocket, looking like this is something that I've done every single day, was a representation to every person of color who's ever had a negative contact with law enforcement. And I can count myself as being a part of that group. I've had negative contacts with law enforcement as a law enforcement officer.
I'm not a history person, but I am a data person, so as I just think about and prepare myself for things, I try to kind of connect the dots because that's the way my brain works. So just wanted to say, to your question about law enforcement interactions, I speak like Kevin does, that if you think back to slavery, and once the slaves were emancipated, there were still laws like vagrancy laws and mischief laws and things that caused slaves former slaves to move back into sort of a criminal or a system where someone had power over them. We've had lynching. So you're always looking at where's the power structure. We have militarized the police, and there's some information about that. And if you think about the tools that law enforcement is using today versus what they've used in the past, as well as tougher sentencing over a period of time. So in 2010, I was a community college trustee, and I go to a national meeting, and we're talking about men and boys, or especially boys of color, and trying to get them into the education system. And they showed a slide, and it said in 1980, there were 100,000 Black men in jail, and there were 500,000 in college. And then it's flipped, and it said in 2010, 30 years later, the numbers are the exact opposite. You have 500,000 Black men in jail, and you have 100,000 in college. So it would cause me to ask why. So again, I would ask your listeners to think through, because there's some things that happen in sentencing and in how the police was armed in a period of time, and our sort of take on drugs and who was actually put in jail, that causes us to be at a point where we are today too, and also causes that friction and that lack of trust that, Kevin talked about in our communities.
And Kim made a great point about the enactment of laws. If you look at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that prohibited slavery, it said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And that's an important part of that, because even after the passage of the 13th Amendment, that's when post-Reconstruction you saw these laws about vagrancy and about debt and about things. That's when they really started to crop up, and why we saw sharecropping become the slave-like institution it became, because so many people, you look at some of those pictures from the 1800s, the late 1800s and the early 1900s of the people that are paying their debt to society, if you will, by working on farms. So many of them are teenagers. They're children, and there was a reason for
that. These are systemic issues that you mentioned about housing, and it's developed over time. And I mean, kind of moving into talking about your experiences, but a little more knowledge as well. But so, what have your experiences been like growing up in this country and realizing that there are real issues of systemic racism embedded in our society? So, and I guess how do these impact the African American community at large, and then how have they impacted you directly?
How have experiences growing up in this country helped me to realize the systemic racism, and how has it impacted me? So I would just say that I lived civil rights as a child. I saw it through a child's eyes. I clearly began to understand as a child. I was born in 1958. Martin Luther King died in 1968. I clearly began to see, as I watched the civil rights movement play out, that Black people were different. There were some things that were not equal. And I think it has shaped my role, my voice, and my commitment to this work. I had access to college as a result of that. I went to college in 1976. I attended a historically Black college in HBCU, that was Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It was a wonderful experience for me to be there. And I was a child who grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. It's a very divisive, racist place. And when I was in the 5th grade, my family moved to a suburban community because of desegregation. And I went to school with Jewish kids. So I lived my sort of formative years with someone who had similar trauma, oppression, abuse in there. So it helped me to understand a little bit more broadly as a young person I looked at the world a little bit different because of my experience, and then what I had learned about someone else's experience up close of people who were my friends. And then, as I said, I went to a historically Black college, Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I think coming out of college, I benefited as a professional entering the workforce when I came to Midland 40 years ago. So, so I saw it as a child. I think it made me committed as an adult, but I think I also had some positive benefit from that because of the time frame that I came into the workforce and got my degree, and what companies were looking for at that time and how they were promoting and advancing people.
Great. Kevin, do you have thoughts on this as well?
Yes, absolutely. I will tell you that I had an early start to understanding how racism could impact me personally. And it actually started on the day I was born. I was born in 1956. And a little bit later on, when I was able to read and everything and saw my birth certificate, I saw that I was born in a place, Kerwood General Hospital in Detroit. And I had never heard of this place. So I was later able to determine that Kerwood General Hospital was actually where Black kids in the neighborhood that I lived in, Black parents, took their children to be born, because even in Detroit, Michigan in 1956, we could not go to white hospitals, and mothers could not have their children born in. People are amazed when they hear that. And I am living testament to the fact that actually did happen. So yeah, 1956, I was born into a segregated hospital, and segregated by law at that time. It would be 1963, because we grew up on the east side of Detroit. I grew up on the east side of Detroit. All of my friends were Black. I didn't know what the difference was. I went to a pretty much all Black school. There were a couple of white kids there, but we didn't treat them any differently. We would, however, go home to Columbus, Georgia, which is where my mom and dad were from. And when I was 7 years old, I accompanied them, as I always did, on the trip back to Columbus. And I will never forget walking into a bank there at the age of 7, standing in line with my grandmother, and having a teller who happened to be white wink at me. We were standing in line of 3 or 4 people back from the counter, and I winked back. I mean, I was a 7-year-old boy. My grandmother pulled me out of the line, took me outside, and she slapped me and said, "Don't you ever wink at a white woman again." That was my first real experience with a difference in the races, and it was one that was physically painful. But I got to go home in a few days. My grandmother had to live there, and this was not that long after Emmett Till, of course. And I was just not aware of the depth of the hatred and the racial animosity at that point. So that was a real wake-up call for me. And then, of course, growing up, even becoming a law enforcement officer and thinking that somehow that's going to make you different, and then having the experience of being pulled over in Livonia by a white police officer because I was driving. I was an FBI agent at the time, and I got pulled over by a Livonia officer who asked for my license and registration. And I said, "Why are you pulling me over?" And he again repeated, "I need to see your license and registration." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you. It's in my gym bag here on the front seat of my car, along with my gun and my FBI credentials. Which one would you like to see first?" And he walked away from the car and said, "Have a good day." He never asked for anything else. And that's when I knew I had been profiled. Even as a new FBI agent, when I first arrived in the Detroit office, I was asked if I wanted to go to Lansing to get my fraudulent, my alias identification. And I wondered, why would I ever have to do that? But there was an expectation that as a Black agent, I was going to be going into some of these clinics and buying drugs from doctors and making drug buys as an African American, because we were all typecast at that time, and I was being typecast as a brand new agent. So yeah, it does impact your life from the day you're born. You have these experiences later on in life that constantly remind you that you are being treated in a different fashion. So it has an impact on you.
For me, I just wanted to say that just because of my makeup, I'm probably a person who's a lot more self-aware. So this is getting back to, maybe a value set. And I think each of us has a value set. So again, challenging ourselves to become more self-aware. But I found that, my values were honesty and fairness, which lines up with social justice. And I also am very courageous. So I say things, and I'm a leadership person, and I just love learning. So I'm one of those people who's always asking questions and very open. I want to say that, being a person of color, being a woman of color, and I think Kevin would agree with this, that life gives you a struggle. But I also want to say I love being a Black woman. I love being a woman of African descent who's an American, because I think it also gives you good things. It gave me strength and resourcefulness and resilience and empathy and compassion. So out of struggle, because sometimes people think that you're in constant pain, and it is hard. But by the same token, it's just like the lesson that Kevin learned from his grandmother. There's a moment where her goal was to keep him safe as a Black man, as a Black boy. Right. And so, but it also teaches us, like, there's some difference here, but we've been very successful through that. My life work as in diversity, equity, inclusion, and as a diversity officer and EEO officer, and serving the community and serving the underserved. So, I'm just giving you sort of a different perspective on it. And just wanting to be an advocate and a fighter for those, because that's what I saw when I was a child. I don't think it's the same for the generations behind. I know you'll have maybe some opportunities to talk to younger people. Their stories are different, and I think we need to listen and understand those stories. And, right now it's just me trying to be a voice. For that, I think living in Midland and being a professional here has been very generous and kind and open to me as an individual. But I also would say that I had an opportunity to do some work probably last year over in Grand Rapids, and I had just done an early morning presentation, and I was back at the Amway Grand Hotel, and I was in doing a little shopping, and I asked the clerk for something, and she was at the back of the store, and I asked where something was, and, she told me, and I walked to the front of the store and began browsing, and all of a sudden she was like right on top of me. So there still are moments, where people, I thought, why did she just show up here? Right? Because I'm Black, and I was obviously had done a stand-up presentation. I, looked very professional. It didn't matter. It was an automatic for her. So that's that implicit bias kind of coming through. So I just wanted to just share sort of some nuanced perspective with you on my experience.
Thank you so much for that, Kimberly. Is there any more information about systemic racism and the change of it over time that you'd like to share with us?
I do. I would. And thank you so much for that. I think that it's important to remember that race is a construct. That means that it was constructed. That means it was constructed for a purpose. And the first thing that I want to do is I just want to talk about it just in terms of a real quick history, because a lot of times people think about, 400 years of history that African Americans have been in this country, and we came here as slaves. So I just want to go through that. So the first African American colonies were in 1619. So slavery actually existed for 157 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the Civil War didn't start until 84 years later. It started in 1861, and then you had emancipation, right, as a result of that. So long history. And then you had another 100 years, and Kevin and I have touched on that, of this Jim Crow segregation and sort of how the community was operating different than our espoused values. And then you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then you can fast forward to today. But the point is, in that time, you can see how deeply embedded the construct of race, which is a construct which says that white people are superior and that African peoples are inferior. And it continues to get kind of baked into the laws, our ways of thinking, our mindsets, and the culture of the U.S. different than the espoused values that we say we are, because we said all men and women are created equal, right? And that's what we want to be. But, there's a moment historically when we have not acted in that manner. And we use the term, so race as a construct, and remember sort of why things are done the way that they are, to put one group more important, more value, higher value than another group. But then when we talk about the concept of anti-racist versus an anti-racist society, because they're two different things. And again, words mean something. And I just want to make sure as we're listening that we all have work to do to be more anti-racist. But what we're fighting is a construct of racial injustice in our laws and how we do some of the things that we do every day. And they're cooked into the law. So you're going to have a racist society when one group has power over another group, and it's sort of embedded in the policies and the practices and how people think and our implicit bias. Okay. So there's two parts of it. We're in it as individuals, but then there's this larger systemic structural racism that we talk about. And a lot of times those words can be used interchangeably to describe the system that we're in, different than being a person in the system.
From that, I want to move forward and say, okay, to our listeners then, what would you like them to do next? What do you want them to know going forward? And then what are some tangible ways that our listeners can fight social injustices and make a positive change in the world?
I think part of one of the things that I love all of the activism that's occurring in the country right now. But activism without action is not much. I had the really good fortune to watch some of Congressman John Lewis's going home celebration today, and his editorial today in the New York Times spoke volumes. I mean, it is literally a call to action. People, it's important that your listeners understand that these are not one-offs. What we have happening in the country does have historical basis. There have been efforts to disenfranchise Black people in this country for a long time. There was a 1972 Notre Dame law study that talked about disenfranchisement in the South following Reconstruction. And they specifically looked at Louisiana, where they said in 1896, rather, there were 164,000 whites registered and 130,000 Negroes. Their terminology, not mine. So 160,000 whites, 130,000 Blacks. In 1900, the first registration year after Louisiana's new constitution had been adopted, there were 125,000 registered whites and 5,300 Blacks registered. By 1904, Black registration had declined to a little more than 1,700. And that was all because of the institution of voter suppression laws, where you had to know parts of the Constitution, or you had to be able to recite different documents that they deemed as important in order to be legally registered to vote. But the end result was systemic disenfranchisement of Blacks and poor whites as well during that time, primarily Blacks. We see some of those same voter suppression efforts happening today. History repeating itself, where you have polling stations closed, the weakening of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court just recently. We have to understand that this is nothing more than history repeating itself, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to make a committed effort to not only get out and vote ourselves by any means necessary, but to encourage others to get out to vote. The other part of this that's important, Kim talked about 1619 and the history of slavery in this country. It's a history that is not widely known. The history of slavery is not. The 1619 project that was published by the New York Times was incredible. I mean, it was very revealing, but it's the truth. And it's the kind of thing that Americans need to hear and need to understand in order for them to appreciate the relevance of Black Lives Matters and why it's important for us to engage. Until we understand the full history of slavery in this country, and until we have our educational systems reflecting that in our textbooks, we are consigning our future generations to the same history that is inaccurate at best, and in some cases, it's actually wrong, especially when they're glorifying some of the Confederate heroes, if you will, from the Civil War. That is history that has been rewritten, and that's the kind of thing that I think needs to change.
Kimberly, do you have some final comments for our listeners about some ways that they can, what would they like to know to moving forward, and what are some ways they can help fight social injustices and just make a positive change in the world?
I appreciate Kevin mentioning history, because I had a social studies teacher who talks about Black history, African American history, as being one of omission and commission, meaning that we've been omitted from history and we've been left out. And history has been changed because it reflects the construct of race. So I'm going to go back to race as a construct. So you're telling stories that fit into the pathway of a certain picture of superiority and inferiority. And so I would say, one of the things, as Kevin said, do your homework in terms of really looking at not only the history of slavery, but the history of the legacy of the accomplishments of Black people in this country, because sometimes we don't know what Black people have done because that history has not been shared. I want your listeners, no matter where they are, they may be Midland, they may be under other places, to understand that every person and every place has a history and a culture and a mindset. And so while we're looking at ourselves, we should also look at our Midland community locally and ask the question, who are we, and are we who we want to be, right? In terms of who we can become. It feels sometimes very lonely with being a Black professional, a Black person, because when racism comes up, it's a very uncomfortable term. And so sometimes what we get is we get silence. And my friends have told me, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. I don't want anybody to say I'm a racist, so they say nothing. And, that's the moment where, to have some compassion and recognize, if you're moving to be a person who wants to take action, as Kevin said, in this space, then part of it is leaning in, and especially with people you're close to, and being willing to listen and share, because it can be a lonely place because everybody expects us to be the voice. And it gets, sometimes your friends get really quiet. I've been really appreciated the friends that I have who love me. My white friends who have reached out to me throughout the last 2 months as things were happening to see how I was doing. Many of them reached out to say, Kimberly, I don't understand. Help me understand. And I gave them information. I want your listeners to understand that it's their work to do. I can help facilitate that, but they have to do the work. It's not my work. And we're kind of at different places on the continuum. Right. I had a friend who called me one day and she said, I just can't imagine how much pain you're in. This was shortly after George Floyd's death. And I said, I'm not in pain. I was in pain when I was 10, when I saw Martin Luther King die. But I'm not in pain at this moment because my trajectory of life as a 60-year-old is a lot different. Right. So I've experienced some different things. But we talked about how it felt to her because she was in pain, but she's at a different point in her learning than I am, on that trajectory around social justice or becoming more aware of what's going on, as in our society. We talked about trust, and I think psychological trust is so important. So, to find spaces where we can be vulnerable, and each of us has those, and to begin to just sort of shed some of the things that are a burden to us and maybe make us feel ashamed or because we didn't know. But, the past is the past. So I'm always a learner forward. You learn forward by saying, what did I learn from that? And what will I do different? Again, to Kevin's point, because it's about the actions that we take forward. So I would say to be very intentional, to look at facts and data as a guide and not and get them from places, that really give good facts and data, to try to inform and keep asking, so why is that way, right? Why does this exist? So to be a lot more curious about some things, to increase their self-awareness about who they are and where they might want to have an impact, but also what their biases are and things that they need to be very conscious of for themselves, and sort of listening ears when they hear bias in other places. And just find ways to engage. I think that you can engage in social justice efforts at the local level. I did some work to look at, just how children of color are treated. And this is not, in just our local school systems are criminalizing our kids, So looking at, Black and brown children and asking, how are they being treated? And is there something that's getting in people's minds about that? That's a local level. I don't, what's going on. There's things at the civic level, in terms of laws. Michigan, there's things that, what are we doing to talk about this more, this whole policing issue that I heard a bill came up shortly after George Floyd. I haven't heard anything else about it. Are we talking with our Congress people saying, where's this bill? And what are you doing with it? And what's your position on it? And saying we want to be an anti-racist country. We want to not have our police acting in the way that they've maybe act, to begin to shift the culture. Because this is it has taken us a long time to get here. As a Black woman and as the Black collective, we can't deconstruct something that we didn't put together. We're the oppressed in the system. We're not the ones to deconstruct it. We need allies to help us, to be able to do that. And so I would just challenge us all to engage for the long term, because it's about our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids.
There's a lot of work to be done, both as individuals and, more importantly, as a society, dismantling the systems in place that are inherently racist. So thank you both so much for bringing your knowledge, your experience, and sharing that with our listeners. It's been an honor talking with both of you today. So thank you both again so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.